Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Ian Rowlands. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Environment here at the University of Waterloo. Welcome. I'm also Associate Vice President International here at UW and a member of WISE as well. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the event this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. I see both Waterloo community members, Waterloo from the university and from broader community as well. So delighted that you are all here to partake in the talk we have this afternoon. And we have Umar Waqas, who is the Director of Engineering at Energy Plus Incorporated, who will speak to the title, Utility of the Future, Perspective from a Local Distribution Company. And we're really excited to have Umar speak with us today. He's an energy professional who is excited and engaged and active on thinking about the ways in which electricity services will be provided during the coming years, thinking about the ways in which we will integrate new technologies, will bring in enabling market reforms, and will reshape customer experiences beyond simply putting the plug into the wall, as the case may be. Umar comes to us having earned an engineering degree from McMaster University, and he's currently, as I mentioned, the Director of Engineering at Energy Plus, where he's overseeing power system refurbishment projects that will involve integrating renewable energy, electric vehicle charging stations, advanced communication systems, and improved consumer interaction with utility markets as well. So please join me in welcoming Umar.
All right, well, thank you everyone for having me here today. And it's quite an honor for me to be here at this prestigious institution, Waterloo, the University of Waterloo, and also the Waterloo Institute of Sustainable Energy, has quite a rich history as far as, technological improvements and advancements. So it's quite an honor for me to be here. And, today I want to take you, I want you to take a moment to reflect on how technology is impacting every facet of our lives. Let's take, for example, self-driving cars, or autonomous vehicles as we call them. And these are really around the corner now, and these have the opportunity to provide us with significant benefits, like reducing the number of car-related injuries that happen, removing congestions on the road, which is I'm actually personally very excited about because I'm on the 401 quite often. And but also it's allowing us to reconsider the whole concept of owning a vehicle. Okay, let's also look at drones. Sometimes you can refer to them as flying cars, but however you look at them. But these are already currently being used. There are applications of companies like Amazon that's already using drones for delivering and improving services for end consumers. How about things perhaps that are not as obvious, like virtual and augmented reality, things that we take for granted today, which right now we're seeing them in the entertainment industries, but they too have many other applications, such as in the medical science fields. Artificial intelligence, this is another domain that has endless potential. In fact, the New York Times in 1997 indicated that it would take a computer at least 100 years, or possibly longer, to beat a human being in the game called Go. This was done 2 decades after in 2016. So things are speeding up. And there's quite a few other things like, improvements to food production, technology improvements in terms of being able to do medical procedures using automation and robotic technologies, and even things that we already take for granted, things like online education that's allowing so many people in the world to access knowledge and information. But I would say perhaps the greatest achievement of our era comes from the possibility of becoming an interplanetary species. I think this perhaps has an endless potential as well. Now, these are all impressive and exciting changes, and they impact they're impacting the very fabric of our society, and we have an opportunity to be involved in shaping this future. So today I'd like to speak to you and walk you through how the electric utility sector itself is changing. I'll start by providing a brief overview of Energy Plus, and in general terms, I'll talk to you about how our industry is transforming. I'll briefly touch on two recent reports. One of them was by the Electricity Distributors Association, which is the Power to Connect roadmap. This talks about the role for electric distributors. And I'll also touch on another report that was recently published and submitted to the Ontario Energy Board, and it was done by sort of an expert panel. So we'll talk about that and what that says. And then I'll conclude with where we know, I'll conclude with our perspective, where we know for sure where the change is happening, where we see some risks and some of the actions that we're taking at Energy Plus to help us, enable us to move towards a better, help us transition forward. After this, what I'll do is I'll open it up to some questions to engage in dialogue, to engage in a bit of a dialogue with you. And I'll just, before I get into my presentation, I just want to point out that we have a few people here from Energy Plus. We have our Vice President of Information Technology Services, Paul Martinello. He's in the back there, can raise his hand. We also have Barbara Shortreed, who's our Vice President of Corporate Communications and Customer Service. We have our Manager of Communications, Allison Can. And then we have two people from my team, Gurdeep Bansal, he's our Design Engineer, and Kyle Hardy, who's our engineering co-op student. So thank you all for being here, and we'll all be around after the event's over if you want to have a conversation with us. So a little bit about Energy Plus. We are an electricity distribution utility. We take power from the high voltage grid. We use step-down transformers to bring that power from the high voltage system to what we call a distribution level voltage. Our distribution level voltage is 27.6 kilowatt or 27,600 volts. And we use, once this power comes into our respective service area, which you'll see here on the right, the north is actually Cambridge, and then the south here we have the County of Brant and parts of the City of Brantford. We sort of surround the City of Brantford, as you can see. And we serve 65,000 customers, just some key things here, and we have about 27,000 distribution poles and 9,600 transformers. From our 27.6 kV system, we use further distribution transformers to bring the power to homes and businesses. So that's the general utility business. This is actually the view from a snapshot of our service area at night, and I always find this interesting. So Cambridge is the brighter city in the north. And then you have the smaller parts, like such as Ayr, Paris, and St. George in the southern portion here. And this picture was actually taken by astronaut Chris Hadfield from the International Space Station. Now, our industry is transforming. And in this transformation, what's happening is that our traditional power system model, it was a fairly straightforward model. Our mandate was to keep the lights on, and in return, customers would pay their power bill. And customers had no real alternative. So this model worked for many years. The emerging power system model, and this picture that you're looking at here was actually published in a Navigant report. Navigant is a consulting agency, and they call this concept the energy cloud. But in that report, and in this image, what you're seeing is sort of a distributed, interconnected, and quite an integrated network. And this is a result of renewables, electric vehicles, and more importantly, the bidirectional flow of power that's taking place. So what does this emerging model mean for utilities? So take, for example, if a customer decides to go off the grid, if a customer decides to employ an alternative technology, whether it be solar, battery, whatever it is, and they are able to effectively go off the grid, what would happen? Well, what would happen from a utility perspective is that we would lose a customer, thereby we would be losing revenue. And as we have more customers that are going off of the grid, we're going to run into a situation where customers, the existing customers that are connected to our system, the cost for them will keep rising. Okay? This phenomena in our industry, some people call it the utility death spiral. Sounds a little dark. But this is the general idea. The idea is that if customers find alternative ways and customers are choosing their path forward, they will go off the grid. And as a utility, the cost to service your existing customers will go up. So what does the utility do about that? And And what we know is that the cost of alternative technologies like wind and solar, they're continuing to improve. So we hear, all sorts of data around that, but cost of renewables is going down each year. So then the question becomes, is grid defection imminent? Perhaps it's not imminent, but is it unavoidable? And so this is the question that our industry is wrestling with on a constant basis. Some of the common trends we're seeing as far as the transformation that's taking place in our industry, these are common terms, and this is something you'll see in many of the presentations that you'll attend, both here in Canada and in North America, and in fact around the world, is that we know that the grid is becoming quite decentralized due to embedded technologies. We also know that the grid is becoming quite diversified due to the availability of generation and storage systems. We know the grid is becoming digitalized because of all of the hardware and software improvements that are being made. We also know that the grid is becoming decarbonized, which is as a result of cleaner sources that are available. And now, most importantly, we're hearing the term the grid is becoming more democratized, or democratization. And this is ultimately referring to the grid being open to customers and referring to the idea of customers or consumers, and oftentimes we're now hearing the term prosumers in our industry, which is that your customers are becoming producers and users of that power. So this is in general terms what we're seeing. Our Electricity Distributor Association, for which Energy Plus is a member, and there's quite a few distribution utilities that are a member. There's about 65 utilities in the province of Ontario. But some of the bigger organizations like Toronto Hydro, Electra, Hydro One, some of the bigger ones are not part of the association, but for the most part, a lot of the mid-sized distributors are. And what the Electricity Distributors Association indicates as part of their Power to Connect roadmap is that the future for utilities involves them becoming what's called fully integrated network orchestrators. Okay? The objective that the EDA believes that the objective for the utilities is to essentially take on a bigger role. And this role involves integrating distributed energy, creating what's called distributed energy resource enabling platforms. So not only do you have solar and wind and all these technologies that are out there, but to be able to really use them for the benefit of the grid and for the benefit of customers. The EDA is also indicating that the utilities need to explore new business models. And finally, the sector needs to consider the possibility of moving towards locational marginal pricing. And now this is said in a very, I would say, more of a softer tone, because this is quite a complex subject, but to move towards this model is something that's discussed, but not in a lot of detail, perhaps. Now, just under the concept of rate design, we have, when we're talking about locational pricing, which is based on prices that you pay based on where you live, we do have a little bit of that set up in our sector. We have urban versus rural rates, but these rates are not very dynamic. They don't change very often, and our industry is still wrestling with how we can make them more effective, and this is really a challenge for us. When I look at it, when I go to, for example, a gas station and I pump gas, I know exactly what I'm paying for. Whereas for electricity, we don't quite have that one-to-one relationship, especially either as homeowners or even at businesses. So we're seeing sophisticated businesses do have those capabilities now, but at sort of an end-to-end home level, home use level, it's not quite there yet. So the EDA made a lot of these recommendations, and I won't go through all of them, but if I was to summarize some of these recommendations in general terms, what the EDA is asking for is that give utilities and distributors more flexibility. And they're also highlighting that the utilities, the distributors, have a bigger role to play in enabling this future grid that is expected to take place. They do have a bigger role to play. The EDA shared a 15-year roadmap. Again, I won't spend too much time going through this, but by year 10, which is kind of the green circle you're seeing on the graph there, the EDA would like to see utilities have DER-enabled platforms available so that so that new business models are appropriate and can be integrated. And then by year 15, it's just a further evolution of that, where the utilities are now more integrated and taking that role of the network orchestrator, or the term FINO that we've saw earlier. I'll talk a little bit about the Advisory Committee on Innovation. So the OEB recently commissioned a high-profile panel. So this included a lot of utility executives. It included private organizations. It included also interest groups. And you can see the qualifications and the people that were involved in that report. But these experts basically came up with their recommendations that were submitted to the chair of the Ontario Energy Board. And the general concept was that this was some of the regulatory and sector level changes that are needed to enable innovation. And so the recommendations were to improve the transparency and consistency of the distribution system process from a planning standpoint, renewable standpoint, establishing clear guidelines for DER projects to make sure there's a level playing field, establish guidelines for commercial arrangements governing performance of non-traditional resources, and finally, re-examining the regulatory restrictions that are on utilities. So I'll talk about that a little bit further here. So from our perspective, from a utility perspective, here's what we know that's happening for sure, and I'll characterize these as opportunities. What we know for sure is that our consumer preferences have changed, and there's a call for a new level of customer engagement. This means enhanced outage management services. This means further social media engagement. We already do some of that today. This talks about automation in customer service, and more importantly, participating between the utility grid and the IO2 devices and enabling that to be able to do that with our end customers. It also talks about tying in pricing, price for the electricity and to the commodity of the product that's being consumed or sold into the grid. The second opportunity that we see, that we know is here, is the call for new business models. And this is to ultimately address the non-wires side of our business, which is essentially embedded technologies like generation, storage, and commercial arrangements, commercial agreements of these types of systems. To give you one example of this, if for example, you had a developer beside the University of Waterloo that owned a lot of land, and this developer wanted to put a large solar farm, and then this developer wanted to sell that power to the university. Under the current rules, that's not allowed. But these rules, there's a call to change these rules. And in fact, the Ontario net metering regulation, for those may not be fully familiar with the term, net metering is, the general idea of net metering is that a facility puts in a solar asset, puts in a generation asset, embedded generation asset, it could be solar, wind, whatever it is, and they use it for their own use. In some circumstances, they may be in a situation where they're producing more power than they're consuming, and in such cases, they put that power into the grid. Now, so this is the Ontario net metering regulation. This is allowed today. That excess power that you produce, you just get the market rate for it. You don't really get any benefit of it. If you got extra power, you put it into the grid and you get the market rate for it. There were some amendments that were being contemplated to that regulation. One of the key things in that regulation that was coming forward was called virtual net metering. So the term virtual net metering, the idea behind that was that if the university was to put a solar plant or any kind of a generation asset here, they can, and they had another facility, perhaps the WISE facility that's further away from here, they can use the excess power here and get a bill credit for that facility. So the idea was that it would allow places like municipalities, like for example, a municipality that operates public parks, baseball diamonds, whatever, they can put all these generation assets there and get a bill credit for their other city-owned facilities. The regulation remained in draft, it's still in status quo, but changes like this are coming and utilities have a role to play. Another key opportunity that we know for sure that's here is the management of the EV infrastructure, or what we call the vehicle-to-grid technologies, that interface. Right now, the system is not set up where if you have a car at home and you can use that car to essentially power your home or to power the grid. And it's not available here, but there are examples of this actually taking place in Germany. And I was talking to Dr. Jin Natwani earlier today, and one of the things he said was, in Germany, in fact, the Nissan Leaf is something that the German transmitter has now characterized it as a generator. So Nissan Leafs can actually produce power into the grid. So the role for utilities is changing very quickly. So these are things that we know for sure that are happening. From a risk standpoint, one of the biggest risks we're facing right now is what we do from our traditional business standpoint. So we have a lot of infrastructure that is at or approaching the end of life. Utilities across North America have this situation where a lot of the plant was built post-50s and 60s, post-World War II era, and now it's gotten to a point where they need to invest in that system. So how do we manage the uncertainty that's associated with the earlier things that I talked about, such as grid defection, such as the opportunities that are associated with alternative technologies? Cybersecurity is another major domain for our sector. And we need to know that there's an important and growing risk that utilities face as far as cybersecurity is concerned. And the key question we ask is, can we sustain a growing system with all types of new IoT technologies and while we protect and safeguard those assets? And actually, Paul here, he's our IT VP, he's quite involved in developing policy around the cybersecurity space in our industry. And I would say perhaps our bigger risk, or biggest risk, is our inability to adapt. Are we going to be outpaced and outcompeted, where utility ownership becomes perhaps a liability? And how would this impact future ratepayers in terms of a rate management or even rate shocks, future rate shocks that this could create if utilities are no longer a profitable business to own and to invest in? There could also be winners and losers. Those that are sophisticated and that can catch up to the change may take significant benefit from it, but there could also be those that could be left behind. And these are things that as a utility we think about and we know that we have to take part in. Now, to manage these opportunities, and I'll conclude here, is some of the action items that we're taking to try to manage this change that's happening in our sector. The first and foremost is we're looking at investing in affiliate businesses. The utilities are quite regulated in our current environment where there's only so much we can do outside of our traditional poles and wires business. For example, right now, if we wanted to invest in a large battery system that can possibly help our grid, we're not allowed to rate base those assets. Whereas if we invest in a transformer station, we are allowed to rate base those assets. We're not allowed to do that right now without regulatory approvals. So investing in affiliate businesses is one opportunity. This is a logo you're seeing actually for Grand River Energy. This is a 1/3 ownership between Energy Plus, Kitchener-Wilmot Hydro, and Waterloo North Hydro. So this is a company that's looking at things that the traditional business, the utility business, cannot get into, and looking at future revenue streams. Grid Smart City is a cooperative. This includes 13 utilities, representing about 750,000 customers. We're about like-sized utilities, and about $1.6 billion in assets. So this is a cooperative where the general idea is that we collaborate, we work together, we co-invest, and we find efficiencies without having to merge into a bigger entity. We're looking at doing cultural shifts. There's a huge need for that. We need to change our mindset. We need to change our thinking. And we need to change our outlook as far as what we're used to doing and what we need to do to move forward. We believe local collaboration is a key. We're actually quite fortunate to have an institution like the University of Waterloo in our backyard, the tech community here in Waterloo region. And we really need to find a way to leverage those opportunities and to really get them involved and get them to ask them the questions that, what does a vehicle-to-grid model look like for you? How do we manage this change? What kind of a model would work in that space? We take the view that the grid is a central network, and it has tremendous benefits for everyone. It's perhaps the most economical way of doing this, and what's happening is our role is changing. We're simply going from a delivering power business to perhaps a more towards a service organization. Perhaps the grid can be viewed as a larger battery that's managing all kinds of transactions that are taking place. And finally, we're doing a lot of work from an advocacy standpoint. So we're reaching out to we're working through our Distributors Association. We're consulting with the regulators, and we're trying to move our organization towards that change. And we believe that we're only gonna be able to do this by taking some small risks. We're not an organization that can take major risks. In our industry, by taking major risks, you could be you can put your shareholder in a significant amount of with a significant amount of financial liability. So we have to be careful in our pace of investment and what we invest in. But at the same time, we know that if we don't do anything, we're also running into a situation where we're risking our future as far as our organization's sustainability is concerned. So we know we have to do something, and what that is it comes with uncertainty, but we know we have to do something, and we can do that by working on small-scale projects, and we can do that by getting some small wins, even if they mean smaller revenue streams. Just to finalize, we know that we need to continue our advocacy efforts and try to push for some legislative change. That's quite important too, and regulatory change, because there are a lot of rules that prevent us from being able to do certain things, and so those are the things that we need to be in the driver's seat, and we need to make sure that those rules serve the interest of our customers as well. And with that, I'll conclude, and I'll say that ultimately our Energy Plus's view is that we serve our customers to the best of our abilities, and we want to make sure that both today and into the future we can provide a reliable product and a reliable service. Thank you very much.
Umar, thank you very much. That was great, and wonderful overview and perspective and insight into Energy Plus's activities and plans and aspirations as well. We've got time for questions now, so invite the audience to put questions forward to our guest speaker, and if you could identify who you are and where you're coming from to start with, that'd be great as well. I will get us going, and then I'll come to you, Dave. I'll get us going, asking about utility death spiral. To what extent are you seeing some grid defections now, and any comments about the kinds of customers who are exploring opting out in some ways?
What we're seeing is a bigger grid defection taking place in the European markets versus the North American markets. This was first pointed out by analysts in sort of the 2011, 2012 stage, where a death spiral is almost imminent. And what we found was that the utilities made a good comeback. And this comeback came because there was a lot of storms that happened in the U.S. So this is where the value of the utility was put into place, where as much as you're talking about grid defection, but in terms of a customer value standpoint, customers really value that reliability and that dependability of being able to call somebody in to be able to get that service and not have to sort of scramble on their own. So the utilities actually made a comeback, and but now fast forward into 2019 and onwards, what we're seeing is that it is still possible, because there could be alternative disruptive technologies that could significantly impact the utility model. But if the utilities are ready to adapt and embrace that change, because frankly that change is happening, and so if the utilities can adapt and embrace that change, the utilities do have a bigger role to play.
Great, thank you. I'll just bring the mic back to you, Dave. There you go.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Umar. Good talk. A few years ago, London Hydro was looking at a different model as a utility where they would be part of a consortium that would own generation equipment, let's say solar PV, and they would either lease the equipment to them and or sell the energy to them as an energy provider. So gas utilities have done this for decades, right? For furnaces and hot water heaters. Has Energy Plus looked at that, where they're the owner of the equipment and they're leasing it out to businesses or residents?
Yeah, I think a lot of this type of activity, we're looking at our views to perform this through our affiliate functions, where the affiliate business could invest and operate these assets. I actually worked with another utility prior to Energy Plus, North Bay Hydro, and I was working for North Bay Hydro, but we also had an affiliate business, North Bay Hydro Services, and we did in fact invest in projects. We did a project, a cogeneration plant at a local hospital. We did a landfill generation at a landfill site. So, and what was happening was the utilities affiliate was putting the capital and taking the construction risk, and then even operating the asset by hiring its own operator. So, and the benefit for both the hospital and the municipality in the case of the landfill was that really the it made a lot of sense for the utility to operate a utility type of an infrastructure, and there was enough enough viability in a project for it to make sense for all parties, and so evaluating those business cases and coming up with those solutions is it's something we're open to and looking forward to. And a lot of this is, I think, more in the institution space. With the private companies, there's always a risk with bad debt, so that's always a consideration. Again, from a utility standpoint, we operate in a fairly risk-averse environment, so it's kind of a cultural shift as well, and a change of mindset, and the level of risk that our shareholders are willing to take as well. So those are things that we wrestle with often.
Thank you. We have a question here.
Thank you for your presentation. Actually, my expertise is about energy system modeling and power to gas, and specifically hydrogen. I was wondering if maybe LDC's company wants to consider hydrogen, because one of the scenario can be for the hydrogen infrastructure is that the LDC can be the owner of this hydrogen infrastructure because of the low-cost electricity that they can have for the off-peak hours. Is there any future? Do you see any future for this, or? Usually the company should own the hydrogen infrastructure. I just wanted to know if maybe there is something in your perspective for the hydrogen infrastructure to be owned by the local distributor companies or not.
Yeah, and absolutely I do, because I like I indicated, the utilities have a bigger role to play, and what that role involves is, there's some discovery that's happening there, but there's nothing really that's stopping a utility from owning distributed generation assets. There are regulatory things that are stopping us, but if we were to look beyond that, there are some synergies in having the utility own and operate and then use those assets for the benefit of the grid. See, that's another thing we don't do. We have a lot of distributed generation assets, but as soon as our distribution feeder is unavailable, there's a problem on the feeder. Well, guess what happens? Those things are disconnected, immediately isolated from our grid. They're providing no benefit to us during outages, and those are the type of ancillary services, we call them, that we need to move towards. And also, I would add that. The utilities also have a bigger role they can play to help the distributed generation markets by providing frequency regulation, providing better voltage regulation and control of those assets. So, again, moving towards more of a service model versus just strictly an operating model.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dan. I'm from the School of Environment and Resource Studies, Resources and Sustainability. You talk about there being a lot of potential business models and things like localized dynamic pricing, that sort of thing. The sector is obviously like a very political sector. You need regulatory change to do anything. So where do you see the sort of political will or the political sort of force coming to try to shape how regulation would change to allow utilities to pursue these different business models?
I would say probably the biggest change that's happening is actually from consumers. Consumers are asking for the change. We're already seeing a lot of our industrial customers are, they're looking for more enhanced services. They're looking, customers are already going ahead and investing in distributed generation assets, peak avoidance projects. We're already seeing that. So we believe that change is coming. We believe the pressure is also building where the the market understands that this existing model needs to evolve, and part of that play is that some of the utilities are moving it towards, but also the private sector is helping with that. They're coming in and they're coming up with all these new technologies and ways of doing things, new ideas that we believe that there is pressure building, and how that change will take place at a regulatory or at a legislative level, I think that there's certainly uncertainty with that, but we believe the change is coming.
Hi. My name is Merta Pirnia. I'm from the Management Sciences Department. I'm wondering, all the changes that you mentioned, like EV integration, presumption, and so on, what do you think about their impact on their long-term models or long-term energy models? Like, do you think we are going to have something like 20 year? Can we do any planning for the next 20 years or next 15 years, considering all the uncertainties which are happening at the moment? How do you see this? And do we get into any problems like, dot curves that we see in California or so on because of all these changes?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I was in a panel recently with a lot of the local utilities, and one of the things we talked about was load forecast, right? And 20 years ago, we could do a load forecast quite easily. Every year we'll add 1 or 2% to our load, and 3% in an optimistic scenario, and that would be sort of a fairly steady and a predictable model. Well, that's out the door now, and predicting that load is very difficult, and more importantly, predicting where that load will take place. We recently, actually in Cambridge, we connected a Tesla Supercharger station, and one of the things we learned was, I think it was about 18 chargers, and one of the things we learned was that each Tesla that's charged on a level 3 charger takes the amount of power of a small factory. Right? So it's about 50 kilowatts. And so we were a little bit surprised that, wow, this is, it's a great customer for us. We like them, but, it's a significant draw from the grid. And so that is posing a huge challenge for us, both from a load increase standpoint as a result of EV, but also the intermittency that comes with some of the decentralized technologies like solar, wind, and even battery. And so load forecasting is becoming very difficult and very sophisticated. I don't know if I have an answer for you and how we're going to manage that going forward. I think the utilities are recognizing that they can have a kind of a best outlook, but know that they have to make some immediate changes and be dynamic in their system planning, and really use technology to its benefit to manage all these changes that are taking place. And I think this stems to the point that there is a big call for local innovation. Every jurisdiction will have a different situation. In California, there's a lot of renewables, but in here in Ontario, we're getting hit with extreme weather. So there's a reason we have some physical limitations that are preventing perhaps a full-out solar outburst, right? In terms of the penetration of renewable technology. So I think it's area specific. And that's why I think there's a huge call for that local innovation. And we think it's going to happen on a smaller scale. We don't think it's going to be at a big scale necessarily.
Other questions? We'll go here and then we'll go to the back.
Hi, I'm Dan Ashowski. I spent 43 years in the environmental industry and retired 2 days ago. But thank you. What I was wondering about with all the problems with single-use plastics around that are not recyclable, is there any trend towards looking at more energy from waste facilities? I know you're a distributor, but there's Emerald Energy in Brampton, and Covanta operates a lot of facilities in the States that are energy from waste, but in Ontario there seems to be a NIMBY factor happening that nobody wants energy from waste, and and just wondering if there's any trend towards that, or is that something that's being looked at, or expanding that capability, because if we're all talking about renewables and the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, but you can always burn plastic if it's done properly. and garbage.
Yeah, exactly. And even, like biogas facilities, like you mentioned, and, like wastewater treatment plants and things like that. We know, actually, David's here from the region, but we know the region is working on 3 projects at their wastewater treatment facilities in Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge, where they're putting in biogas generators using the digester gas to produce power. As far as a trend, I don't know if I know of any major trends that are moving in that direction. I'm not as educated in that industry. But, in general, to your point, I agree. There is a bigger push towards, more solar and wind and these kind of, battery and these types of things. But there's not a lot of, perhaps not a lot of value, not a lot of attention that's given to other things like biogas or even, I would say, cogeneration systems where, we do have them in some applications, but there's many more applications where they could be used.
Thanks, Umar, and I did forget to introduce myself. So I am Dave Rowe, but I left the region 2 months ago. I'm with Vigor Clean Tech. So we built all the solar up at the Evolve 1 building in the North Campus from here. Good. Let's see if I can remember my question now. I'm assuming by your biography you're involved in the integrated regional resource planning. Is that fair? So, the ISO is working on the second version of that. What does Energy Plus, or what would Energy Plus like to see in the next plan to be completed next year that wasn't in the first plan, relevant to the changing role of the utility?
Yeah, that's a good point, David. I guess first and foremost, the ISO is they are looking at it from a slightly different perspective from what I'm finding this time around, whereas what they would have last time around. The ISO is taking a greater interest in how non-wires alternatives can play a role, perhaps even deferring some of the investments that are needed into the system. One immediate example I can give you is we were doing reinforcement of our 115 kV transmission line in the Brant County area, and it was a capacity constraint issue for us where the transmission line was nearing capacity, and so they needed to increase the capacity by upgrading it. So the local utilities, including ourselves, needed to make a significant investment to provide that load guarantee to the transmitter Hydro 1 so they can make those reinforcements. So one of the things that we saw the ISO do was to ask the utilities, could we do a local demand response program where we could get the users to manage, come up with some kind of a pilot program where they can pay users to reduce their peak demand usage when called upon, when dispatched upon. So that was, I would say, an initial look by the ISO. Now we're seeing a bigger play. We're going through a regional resource planning as we speak, and one of the things the ISO is looking for is optimization. And how can we, if we're building an asset, how can we optimize that asset so that it's used by more parties? And how do we see the play in battery and other technologies that are coming into play? These are long-term planning, and regional planning in general, I find it has a lot of other barriers that are not necessarily technology dependent. There's a lot of other things that have to, there's a lot of parties to coordinate with, and it's often a difficult exercise to go through to, every party can have a different viewpoint on that. But again, I think the ISO is very aware of it, and I would give them credit that they're doing a good job at changing how the utilities are thinking about the future.
Great, thank you for that. Oh, and the question here.
Peter Jie, I have retired from chemistry. At one point, I taught nuclear technology to the engineers here. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, of course, distribution is to consumers, but there's also the producer of energy. Nuclear energy has been, going up and down over the years. And currently, even in Ontario, there are still some nuclear power generation. What's in your point, in the current culture, what is the aspect of nuclear energy?
That's actually a great question, and actually, Ontario, about 57% of the province of Ontario's power comes from nuclear. So nuclear, from centralized nuclear facilities. So this is a significant baseload generator for Ontario. Hydro is another one, hydro generation as an example. So, this is a great point, and the point here is that, you've got these significant and long-term investments that you have to make in certain types of what we call baseload assets. And then how do you match those investments? So you have to do those investments, and or you choose to do those investments. And when you do those investments, how do you manage the amount that you pay for those versus what you're willing to pay for production at a local level? And that balancing is where there's a disconnection in our current markets, where we have these we have a wholesale market, and we have all these private generation contracts, fixed price contracts, and then now we have this new domain of decentralized energy that's coming on. And so how do you manage that market? And and one of the things actually I learned quite early on in my career when I was working on cogen systems was that, whether you're investing in a 2 megawatt cogen plant or whether you're investing in a 6 megawatt cogen plant, the incremental cost to go from 2 megs to 6 meg or to go from 6 megs to 20 megs is actually quite minimal. So nuclear, I would think, would work in a similar manner, whether if you're refurbishing for, say, 40% of Ontario's base load versus 50%, the incremental cost is for going from that 40 to 50 would be fairly low. So how do you manage, how do you have a business case where you can manage the generation markets but also manage the distribution and the consumer market? So that's actually a great question, and I think this is something where our industry needs to focus on and to explore further on how they can solve problems like this. Because yes, we do have a big wholesale market, but how do we align that wholesale market and our distributed generation markets together so that customers can see a benefit and not see rate increases as a result?
Umar, let me come in with the final question. Did the first one, I'll do the final one as well. I noted on one of your slides collaboration, and I noted University of Waterloo and WISE there, and thank you very much for including that. I guess I'll just give you an opportunity, an open-ended question. Any wisdom you would give us at the university about how we can be effective collaboration partners? And I think both in terms of means of engagement and, say, topics of engagement. WISE is all about collaboration across the university and then within the university out into the community as well. Any things we should keep in mind about either our strategies as we engage with external partners or kinds of topics that are of interest?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think I would start by saying that one of the benefits that we as a utility have is we have operational data. So we're managing equipment, we're managing the performance of the equipment, we have a day-to-day engagement with our consumers. So we do have access to a lot of information, and there's a lot of untapped potential there. There is a lot of things we can do with that information. And I think collaboration with WISE, with the University of Waterloo is very important. And I think where we can bridge the gap is where we can come to you with some of our issues and say, here's what we're thinking. And we don't have an answer to the problem, but here's the problem that we think we're facing, and come back to us with a recommendation. And then when you do come back to us with a recommendation, you can say, well, this hypothesis is not going to work in our environment because these are our physical constraints. So I think we can help. I think both parties can work in a manner where we can help each other out. We can help the university out from a kind of improving the quality of the research and the areas of focus, and the university can help us with giving us the edge as far as the innovative solutions are concerned. So I see a huge play there.
Excellent, fantastic. Please.
I'm Ramalingam, Senior Research Fellow of WISE. Talking about the collaborative activities, one of the primary objectives of WISE is to make affordable energy for to the humanity. For this, a lot of activities are going on. Especially, WISE is looking at the possibility of creating value addition for the society. So, if this can be integrated, and if the objectives of the social development goals of the United Nations, the poverty eradication, making available energy for the people, all these things can be integrated. It will be a great thing. So on this, WISE is working, a lot of activities, especially Dr. Jatin is working on this. And then we in India, I'm from India, and we have got collaborative arrangements on this. And then on this, possibly a partnership with the utility company in Canada would be of great help.
Got your business card.
Yeah.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Excellent, great. I think great points to conclude on, in the sense that you've stimulated a lot of thinking, insight into the activities in Energy Plus, and we appreciate that very much. And the expert reaction to the many questions, and then setting the stage for continuing the dialogue as well. So we appreciate it very much. Please join me in showing our appreciation.